The next station will be Fortuna 69.
Because of the way that new content has still been just isolated islands of grind, the previous quote-unquote large areas of the plains of Eidolon and Fortuna we've been given are not as popular as they used to be when they were initially released, and that's honestly a shame. Open world play for Warframe sounds incredible on paper, because for so long we've been used to simple tileset-based missions with varying appearances in terms of gameplay. Open world in Warframe had substantial potential, partly because exploration in a ground environment rather than a space environment was considered to be a new but appealing idea for Warframe, not to mention that open world content implied it would have a true end game, given that open world aren't as constricted as traditional tileset-oriented gameplay. As we know, that didn't happen, once with the plains of Eidolon, and once again with Fortuna. That isn't to say that they're not enjoyable, because they are. For a limited amount of time. However, just like the Kuvalich system, once you've completed it by acquiring everything you want to have or need to have for mastery rank, you're done. There's quite literally no need to go even touch it again, unless more loot is added into the droptable for it. Nowadays the constant and monotonous grind to get stuff is so standard that the real endgame is actually just grinding for stuff to get, such as decent railjack parts or for ephemeras. Anyways, that's not the topic here. If you ask me, it's possible to get people to be interested in revisiting the plains of Eidolon and Fortuna without forcing them to mindlessly grind, because at the end of the day, Warframe is a game. Games are supposed to be fun, not a fucking job. Let's talk about the plains of Eidolon for starters. Those of you who have also played the very obscure RPG known as C9 might remember that in the highest level area of the game existed one particular dungeon known as the Occupied Guardian Tower. Most of you have no idea what the hell I'm talking about, so I'll give a simple description of what it is. The tower is a dungeon in the highest level area of the game which can only be done solo, and depending on how strong your equipment is, can take anywhere from 20 minutes up to an hour. Consists of 40 floors, each of which can contain either a boss, a mini-boss and trash enemies, or a random NPC encounter that can award better loot. All bosses drop rare loot, with the chance of also dropping higher grade perfect tier loot. You cannot leave the tower unless you go through all 40 floors or do the first 20 floors, which will grant you the option of leaving. To put it even more simple, the tower was a high-level area which enticed experienced players to run it in hopes of acquiring high-tier items which could either be used, turned into crafting materials for better items, or sold to lower-level players for their own usage. Adapting something similar to this for the plains of Eidolon would be an interesting choice in my opinion, particularly because the Unum Tower is already present, and we do not know anything about it besides it being a fleshy pillar that can talk. In a nutshell, I think it would be enticing for quote-unquote veteran players to return to the plains of the tower were turned into a very high-level mission or dungeon that awards loot that is actually considerable, such as Umbra Forma, new ephemeras, exclusive weapon parts such as Vandal or Wraith weapon parts, or relics for prime parts that have been vaulted. That brings about its own problems, because traditionally Warframe considers difficulty to simply be throwing nullifiers and other equally annoying enemies at you and making them all high level. That wouldn't be the case for the tower, because otherwise it would literally be the exact same as all other high-level content in Warframe that forces the same new core tank Warframes to be taken. In keeping with the spirit of Warframe, I would say the best way to make a tower raid like this exist in the game would be to make it objective-based, but every single run is different, and every consecutive run increases the level of the enemies you fight but makes things even by giving a random buff to the players, such as increased critical chance or reduced ability cost. To make it even more challenging, make the tower be a solo-only mission. The point of the tower is to allow players to stay in for as long as they want or can handle without making them feel like they're playing against something unfair. As an example, for the first run a player might be tasked with exterminating enemies, followed by rescuing an NPC, followed by protecting them for a few waves of defense. Once 3 modes have been cleared, the player is given loot and the option to extract. If they choose not to extract, they will continue playing, only this time with completely different objectives, slightly higher enemy level, and a random buff for the player that only lasts for that run. DE really doesn't need to reinvent the wheel to make content be potentially fun. All they have to do is keep things exciting, rewarding, and actually somewhat challenging. Now for Fortuna. Instead of giving Fortuna simple dungeon or other high-level mission, I think it would be wise to use Fortuna as a true open-world area for Warframe. Imagine if Fortuna allowed players to go beyond the boundaries of the map to explore and fight enemies beyond the boundaries of what is considered to be safe. In other words, let's pretend that Fortuna gave players the opportunity to explore past the standard Fortuna map, rewarding them for doing so. Random encounters would be possible, finding enemies would be guaranteed, and scavenging rare loot would be an opportunity. To keep things relatively fresh, no matter how far out players explore, progress would be completely wiped every month or so, due to a savage snowstorm or some other equally reasonable excuse, at which players could go back out and see a different looking world and game experience. Of course, that's all hypothetical. As I've stated before, I firmly believe that DE has not yet truly tapped into the creative potential for Warframe, and again, the question remains. Do they believe the same? Only time will tell. Thank you for watching.